It's often been pointed out that the letter of James has a great deal in common with Matthew's gospel, and certainly it does. And those are connections that are worth teasing out, particularly connections between the Sermon on the Mount and James' letter. It's also been pointed out that James has a lot in common with the Bible's wisdom literature, particularly Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, but especially Proverbs. There is a lot of commonality between James and Proverbs. James talks a lot about wisdom, and he gives a lot of what you might call wisdom counsel, the kind of counsel that you find in the book of Proverbs. One area where James does this extensively is in his teaching on the tongue. This section at the beginning of James chapter 3 is one of the most practical and certainly one of the most convicting sections of the whole letter. I don't know anybody who could read this without coming away deeply convicted about their speech. Now, I believe that James is primarily speaking to teachers. And I think when he talks about different ways that the tongue can be used, he's primarily talking about the rhetoric of preaching within the church. But the things that he says apply more broadly than that. They apply to all of us as believers, and they apply to our everyday speech, not just to, say, sermons. But one thing I find very interesting is in James 3:6. And I think there's an implicit contrast here that we need to recognize and take into account. This is what James says in chapter 3, verse 6. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire by hell. When James wants to describe the destruction that can be wrought by our tongues, he uses this imagery of a fire. He says the tongue is a fire. The tongue has been set on fire by hell, and now the tongue spreads hellfire. And so just as fire can destroy a home or destroy crops, so we can use our tongues to destroy families or to destroy livelihoods. Our tongues are fires. But what I find interesting, James says here the tongue is a fire. This is not the only place we find the tongue as a fire in the New Testament. Think about Acts chapter 2. There we have tongues of fire that come upon the disciples. We see the tongue as a fire there as well. Only this time it's not a fire that comes from below. It's a fire that comes from above. It's not hellfire. It's the fire of heaven. It's the fire of God's Spirit coming upon the disciples so they can speak God's truth. And on that day, Peter, with this tongue of fire, preached the gospel, and it did not bring destruction. It brought salvation. Salvation to 3,000 people. And so I think what James is doing here is setting up a contrast. All of our tongues are on fire. We all have flaming tongues. Our tongues are all flames. The question is, what kind of flame, what kind of fire is your tongue? Is it hellfire? Is it bringing destruction? Do your words destroy things and burn things up? Or is your tongue the flame of the Spirit? Is your tongue set on fire by heaven? Is your speech spiritual speech, so you speak the words of the Spirit's fire? Which is it? Do you speak with the fire from below or the fire from above? And that is the contrast here. And this feeds right into what James goes on to say in the next section. And this is why I think we're on good ground to see this contrast between tongue of fire, fire from above, or tongue of fire, fire from below. Is it the Spirit's fire or hell's fire? He goes on in the very next section to contrast the wisdom that comes from above with the wisdom that comes from below. This heavenly wisdom contrasted with the demonic wisdom. And I think that's exactly the kind of contrast he's already implicitly developing with the tongue. Do we use our tongues to speak in a heavenly way or a hellish way?